There's a particular kind of silence that follows you home after a room full of people decides you're wrong, before you've even had the chance to be right. You start to wonder
All
if
right,
being
look at
alone
lot
in
number
your judgment
42
means
here.
you've
Do I
made a
hear
mistake,
500?
or just that no one else was brave
$500
enough
bid.
to look
Sold
closer.
your way.
Some decisions only reveal their worth to the one person who refused to walk away. Here's where it begins. Frost still clung to the fence rails when the first truck rattled into the auction yard outside Millbrook. By 9 o'clock, 30 men stood shoulder to shoulder along the rail, breath fogging the cold October air, waiting for something worth their time. A woman in a canvas coat, too big for her frame, moved slower than the rest, one hand pressed low against her belly. She didn't speak to anyone. She just watched the gate. Somewhere behind her, a man laughed and said loud enough for half the yard to hear, "Somebody oughta tell her the maternity ward's the other direction." When the handlers finally dragged out an animal too thin to be worth the diesel it took to haul her there, the woman's eyes didn't move away like everyone else's did. The cow's ribs stood out beneath a hide gone dull and patchy. Her hip bones looked sharp enough to tear through skin if she so much as stumbled. Somewhere in the crowd, someone whistled low, the kind of whistle that meant nothing good. Eleanor Voss was 33 years old, 5 months pregnant, and standing on $250 that had to last her through winter. Feed, fuel, groceries, whatever the bank decided to send in the mail. Her husband Daniel had been gone 11 months. Long enough that people had stopped asking how she was holding up. Not long enough that she'd stopped listening for his boots on the porch before she remembered. Every decision on the farm used to be a conversation. Now it was just her, standing in a cold yard, watching a dying cow the way other people watched a house fire. Walt Hendrickson, who farmed the section next to hers and had known her since she was a girl trailing after her father, leaned in close. "Eleanor, that animal's not worth the rope to lead her home." She didn't answer him. She was watching the cow's eyes. They were clear, alert, not the eyes of something that had already given up. Behind the rail, a young hand shifted his weight and muttered something to the man beside him about wasted diesel and a wasted morning. Somewhere further back, a dog barked once at the smell of the animal, and then went quiet, as if even the dog had decided it wasn't worth the noise. The auctioneer dropped the number again. Nobody moved. Nobody wanted to be the fool who paid for a carcass that hadn't finished dying yet. Eleanor felt her own pulse hammering somewhere in her throat. She raised her hand. $35. The auctioneer blinked, then called it, almost relieved to be rid of the thing. "Sold," to the woman in the too big coat. Walt stared at her like she'd set the money on fire in front of him. Eleanor felt almost the same. She had no husband to check her thinking. No room left for a mistake this size. But as she led the trembling cow toward her truck and decided, without quite meaning to call her Nettie, she understood something with a clarity that scared her more than the $35 had. The real gamble had never been the money. It was whether she could still trust the judgment that had once helped her and Daniel build something out of nothing, and whether that judgment had survived him. The drive home took 11 minutes. It felt like an hour, with Nettie swaying in the trailer behind her and Eleanor gripping the wheel like it might steady something other than the truck. In the barn, under a bare bulb that buzzed when it caught a draft, Eleanor did not simply hope the cow would live. She got down to work examining her, one section at a time, the way her father used to before he trusted a purchase. She lifted Nettie's lip and looked at her gums. Pink, not pale. She pressed 2 fingers against the cow's flank and counted breaths, slow enough, not the shallow panic breathing of something truly failing. She ran her hands down each leg, feeling for heat, for swelling, for anything that would explain the wasting beyond simple hunger. She found nothing but bone close under skin. She lifted each hoof in turn, checked between the claws, watched Nettie's ears flick with mild annoyance rather than the dull nothing of an animal too far gone to care. Then she stepped back and just watched. Nettie shifted her weight, took 3 careful steps toward the water bucket, and drank. Nothing Eleanor had seen proved the cow was safe, but the pattern was pointing somewhere specific. This didn't look like disease eating a body from the inside. It looked like an animal that had simply gone too long without enough of anything. Neglect explained the ribs. Neglect did not explain a clear eye and a working appetite. Eleanor had learned that difference from her father before she'd learned to drive, and she leaned on it now the way she once leaned on his arm. She remembered him crouched in this same barn, decades earlier, running his hand down the leg of a horse a dealer had tried to unload cheap. He'd told her, more than once, that most people only ever looked long enough to feel something. Fear, pity, disgust. Then they stopped looking and called that feeling a fact. Her father had taught her to keep looking past the feeling, to let the animal's body answer the question instead of her own nerves. Eleanor sat in the straw a long moment, letting Nettie's slow, steady breathing settle something in her own chest. Then, running a hand slowly along Nettie's side, she felt it. A fullness that didn't belong on a frame this wasted, low and firm where the rest of the body had nothing left to spare. She went still. She pressed again, gentler now, and felt the shape settle into certainty in her mind. Nettie was carrying a calf. Eleanor sat back on her heels in the straw and let that fact rearrange everything. She hadn't bought one failing animal for $35. She might be responsible for 2 lives now, and the second one had no chance at all unless she could rebuild the first from nothing. Winter pressed into her thoughts before she'd even finished the thought about the calf. She had almost no money for feed. Every mistake from here would cost more than she had to lose. She did not need hope. She needed evidence, patience, and the discipline to keep asking the question her father had taught her on the same ground 20 years back. Not, how bad does it look? But, what is actually causing what I see? That question had gotten her through the gate with Nettie. It would have to carry both of them through what came next. Being right about the diagnosis meant nothing if one bad week of feeding or one hard freeze finished what neglect had already started. Eleanor refused to dump a full ration into the trough and call it care. Instead, she broke everything into small, careful steps. Small feedings, spaced out, watched closely. She noted how Nettie chewed, how long she stood before resting, how quickly she came back to the fence when Eleanor's boots crossed the yard. To keep herself honest, she went into the house and pulled down the old ledger from the shelf above Daniel's desk. He'd used it for seed orders, fuel receipts, equipment repairs. His handwriting still filled the early pages, notes from a life the two of them had been building together before it stopped. Eleanor stared at those pages a long moment. Then she turned to a blank line near the back and wrote, in handwriting that didn't match his at all, Nettie, day 1. From then on, every feeding, every small change, every morning's observation went into that book. The first week gave her almost nothing worth celebrating. Twice, Nettie went down in the straw and struggled to get back up, legs sliding before they finally caught. The second time it happened, Eleanor stood in the barn before sunrise, one hand braced against the stall wall, wondering if desperation had made her see hope where there wasn't any left to find. Maybe Walt had been right after all. Maybe the cow had only looked salvageable because Eleanor needed something, anything, to still be worth saving. But the ledger forced her to keep looking instead of just feeling. The pattern in her own handwriting showed Nettie was eating. She just kept burning it off faster than it could do any good, fighting the cold as hard as she was fighting the hunger. So Eleanor stopped treating the cold as weather and started treating it as an expense she could actually manage. She dragged scrap lumber and old roofing tin into the barn, stacked straw bales into a crude windbreak, and gave Nettie a dry corner shielded from the worst of the draft. The change wasn't dramatic. It was measurable, and that turned out to matter more. Eleanor started coming out before first light, lantern in one hand, a coffee can of grain in the other, just to watch how Nettie greeted the morning before anything else could interfere with the reading. A cow that struggled to lift. Her head told a different story than a cow that turned toward the sound of boots in the snow. Some mornings the story was better than others. There was a stretch in the second week when a hard freeze settled over the county for 4 straight days, and Eleanor found herself checking the thermometer nailed to the barn door more than she checked her own reflection. Every degree the mercury dropped felt like a debt Nettie's body would have to pay somehow. By the second week, Nettie stayed on her feet longer between rests. By the third, Her appetite had sharpened into something that looked almost like impatience at feeding time. By the fourth, she walked out to the pasture fence on her own and lowered her head to graze without being led. Eleanor wrote all of it down. The ledger was changing, page by page. The early half still belonged to Daniel, and the farm the two of them had run side by side. The new pages belonged to her alone, proof, in her own hand, that the place hadn't ended when it had stopped writing in it. For the first time since the funeral, Eleanor let herself believe that carrying on alone didn't have to mean carrying on blind. But Nettie's recovery had only brought them both to the edge of the real test, because January was going to ask for something neither of them had much strength left to give. By then, Nettie had filled out enough to look like a cow again instead of a rack of bones with a hide stretched over it. But months of neglect don't leave a body just because the ribs stop showing. Eleanor knew that whatever weakness feeding hadn't fixed yet, calving would find and expose without mercy. She was nearly 8 months along herself by then, moving slower, sleeping badly, waking every morning to the same quiet question sitting on her chest before she'd even open her eyes. Which of them would need help first, and would there be anyone close enough to give it? On one of the coldest nights of the winter, with ice glazing the lane and wind leaning hard against the barn boards, Nettie went into labor. At first, Eleanor just watched, timing the rhythm of the contractions the way she'd watched her father do 100 times as a girl. Then the rhythm went wrong. The calf wasn't presenting the way it should. One front leg had folded back instead of stretching forward, and Nettie was starting to tire against a labor that wasn't going anywhere on its own. Eleanor knew she didn't have the strength in her own condition to pull a calf by force, and she wasn't foolish enough to try. So she reached, instead, for what she'd learned long before this farm belonged to her alone. Working slowly, she eased her hand in only far enough to hook 2 fingers around the folded leg. She drew it forward gently until it lined up the way it needed to. Then she backed away and let Nettie's own labor finish the work. The next hour felt like it had no edges. Eleanor stood at the stall rail with one hand pressed against her own belly, listening to Nettie breathe through the wind outside. 2 mothers in the same freezing barn, carrying more than their bodies wanted to carry, both trying to make it through the same bitter night. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that only shows up when a person has been carrying 2 lives at once and has no one to hand either of them to, even for an hour. It settles differently than ordinary tiredness. It sits in the decisions instead of the body, second-guessing itself in the gaps between contractions. What does it actually mean to trust your own hands when the last person who trusted them with you is gone? Farmers who have never stood alone in a barn at 3 in the morning tend to talk about instinct like it's simple, like it either exists or it doesn't. Eleanor understood, standing there, that instinct is really just memory doing its job under pressure. Every hour she'd once spent watching her father and later watching Daniel, arriving all at once, right when she needed it most. Shortly before dawn, the calf finally slid into the straw, wet and trembling and unmistakably alive. A small heifer, breathing hard, blinking against the barn light. Nettie stayed on her feet. Eleanor did too, though barely, sliding down against the stall wall the second she was sure both of them were safe. For several days after that, simple survival felt like enough of a miracle to hold on to. Then, Eleanor poured some of Nettie's milk into a glass jar to set on the counter, and noticed a thick band of cream rising across the top, deeper and richer than anything she'd expected from an animal that had nearly died 3 months earlier. The cow everyone at the auction had written off as worthless was producing milk with real weight to it. Eleanor stood in her kitchen holding that jar and understood, slowly, that she might have spent $35 on more than one life. She might have spent it on the beginning of something the farm actually needed. That discovery should have felt like the finish line. Instead, it turned out to be the start of the next problem she couldn't afford to get wrong. Rich milk like that didn't keep itself. Eleanor knew exactly what it meant, and exactly how little margin she had for wasting it. Up in the barn loft, under a canvas sheet and years of dust, sat the old hand-crank butter churn her mother had taught her to use as a girl. She hauled it down, cleaned it out, skimmed the cream from Nettie's milk, and worked it in small batches, trusting memory more than confidence. The first results looked almost too good. Pale gold, dense, richer than anything sitting on a shelf in town. Vivian Cross, who ran the general store in Millbrook, agreed to take a few pounds on consignment, more out of neighborly patience than real expectation. Eleanor carried the wrapped butter into that store, feeling something she hadn't felt since before Daniel died. The possibility that the farm might finally hand her cash instead of another bill. 2 days later, Vivian sent the whole batch back. Spoiled. The failure cut deeper than it should have, because the butter itself had been good. The problem was storage. Her refrigerator, old before Daniel had even bought it secondhand, could no longer hold a steady cold, and a replacement was money she didn't have and wouldn't have for a long while yet. For one evening, the solution looked brutally simple. No refrigeration, no butter business. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledger closed in front of her and let herself believe, just for that one night, that this particular door was shut. She thought about asking Walt if she could borrow space in his cellar, then thought better of it. She'd already spent enough of the county's patience proving him wrong once. She didn't want to owe him a favor on top of it. The baby moved against her ribs while she sat there, a small, insistent reminder that giving up wasn't really an option sitting in front of her, whatever the refrigerator wanted to suggest. But Eleanor had already relearned, with Nettie, that a lack of money didn't automatically mean a lack of options. She thought about the way her grandmother had kept dairy cold long before a steady refrigerator reached every farmhouse kitchen in this part of the county. Behind the house, where the ground dropped toward the tree line, a shaded limestone creek ran cold even on the warmer afternoons, fed by a spring that never seemed to remember what season it was. Eleanor cleared a small, sheltered spot along the bank, set stoneware crocks where the current could wrap around them, covered the butter with damp cloth, and started dating every batch so she'd know exactly how long each one had been sitting in the cold water. She tested the first batch after 2 days. It held. She tested the second after 3. It held too. Vivian gave her one more chance, more out of curiosity now than charity. Nothing came back this time. Within a few weeks, people in Millbrook weren't asking Vivian for local butter in general anymore. They were asking for Voss Farm butter by name. Vivian started keeping a small chalkboard by the register, and after the third good batch, she wrote Voss Farm butter fresh across it in careful letters, without Eleanor asking her to. Customers who'd never once mentioned Eleanor's name at the auction started stopping their trucks at her mailbox, asking if she had any left. Eleanor hadn't solved the problem by buying better equipment. She'd solved it with observation, with knowledge that had been sitting quietly in her family for 2 generations, and with what the land behind her house had been offering for free the whole time. When money disappeared, knowledge became the only capital she had left, and it turned out to be enough. Just as the farm finally stopped, feeling like it was one bad week away from falling apart completely, the value Eleanor had built started to draw the attention of the one man who'd once been in a hurry to walk away from all of it. By early spring, the numbers in Daniel's old ledger had started to shift into something Eleanor almost didn't recognize. Butter sales covered feed. Better feed kept Nettie strong. A strong Nettie meant richer milk. Richer milk meant more cream and more butter. And more butter meant money finding its way back into the farm instead of only leaving it. It wasn't wealth, and Eleanor knew better than to call it that. The barn roof still leaked in one corner. Bills still arrived faster than she liked. Every dollar still had somewhere to go before it ever reached her hand. But for the first time since Daniel died, the farm had stopped shrinking. It had a small circle now that could feed itself. Cow to milk, milk to cream, cream to butter, butter to cash, cash back to feed. A few weeks later, after carrying her pregnancy through the same brutal winter that had nearly finished Nettie, Eleanor gave birth to a healthy son. For a short stretch after that, the farm finally looked like a place rebuilding instead of a place merely surviving. That quiet into the afternoon, an unfamiliar truck came rolling slowly up the gravel lane. Eleanor recognized the driver before he'd even climbed out. Dale Pruitt, Nettie's former owner, stood by his truck and looked out toward the pasture, where Nettie grazed beside her now healthy, growing heifer. He'd heard the stories, the way everyone in the county had by then. He knew the cow had survived. He knew the calf had turned out strong. He knew Voss Farm butter was selling, and he'd heard people asking whether that heifer might carry the same rich traits as her mother. He stood at the truck door a moment longer than he needed to, looking out at the pasture the way a man looks at something he's already decided belongs to him. Eleanor came out onto the porch with her son balanced on one hip, and something in her face must have told him this wasn't going to be simple. Dale didn't arrive shouting. That made the whole thing worse. Somehow, he spoke, calmly, almost reasonably, and told Eleanor there had been a misunderstanding back at the auction. He said he'd sold her the cow, not the future value of the calf that cow happened to be carrying at the time. Eleanor understood exactly what had really changed since October. Dale had been more than willing to walk away from every ounce of that risk when Nettie looked worthless standing in the auction yard. Now that Eleanor had carried the cost, the sleepless nights, and the uncertainty long enough to turn that risk into something worth having, he wanted a piece of what she'd built. Standing there with her newborn son inside the house and Nettie's healthy calf grazing behind the fence, Eleanor understood that none of this would be settled by hard work alone this time. The final test wasn't whether she could save Nettie anymore. It was whether she could hold on to everything that saving her had created. Eleanor didn't raise her voice. She walked into the house, came back out with Daniel's old ledger, and opened it to the back cover, where she'd tucked the auction paperwork the day she'd bought Nettie for $35. The wording on the receipt was plain enough that even Dale couldn't argue with it. Nettie had been sold as a bred cow, with full ownership transferred at the point of sale. He read it twice, standing there in the yard, and found nothing left worth saying. He'd abandoned the risk the day he let that cow go for $35. Now, he had to leave the reward behind with it. Word of what had happened moved through the county faster than Eleanor expected. Farmers who'd once shaken their heads at her purchase started showing up at the fence line with actual questions instead of pity. They wanted to know how she judged Nettie's condition that first day, how she kept her fed through the worst of winter without wasting what little money she had, how she kept butter cold with no working refrigerator, whether the heifer might someday be for sale. Walt Hendrickson came by eventually, with his teenage son trailing behind him. He didn't apologize, not in so many words. He just nodded toward Nettie grazing in the afternoon light and said, "Show him what you were looking at that day." Eleanor did. She walked the boy through the same things her father had once shown her. The eyes, the gums, the breathing, the way a starving animal still fighting for its life looks different if you know where to look from one that's already given up. The boy asked how she'd known to keep looking when everyone else had already made up their mind. Eleanor thought about it for a moment before she answered. She told him that everyone in that yard had seen the same cow. Most of them had just stopped looking a few seconds too early. Walt stood off to the side while his son crouched in the straw the way Eleanor had crouched months earlier, running careful hands along an animal's ribs. He didn't say much more that afternoon. He didn't need to. He'd already said the only thing that mattered, out loud, in front of his own boy. By the following winter, Eleanor owned several dairy cows, supplied 2 small stores in the county instead of one, had a growing list of customers asking for her by name, and had finally gotten around to fixing that leak in the barn roof. She wasn't wealthy. She was steady, which mattered a great deal more. On her kitchen table, Daniel's old ledger still told the whole story in its own quiet way. His seed and fuel entries filled the front pages. Nettie's recovery filled the middle, in Eleanor's handwriting, one small entry at a time. Butter orders filled the back and kept filling it. Everyone standing at that auction fence back in October had looked at the exact same cow. Eleanor had simply asked a better question than the rest of them. Not what is she worth today, but why does she look this way, and what might she become if I understand the reason? That lesson outlasted the cow, and it outlasted the butter, too. Some evenings, Eleanor still walks out past the fence line just before dark, her son on her hip, and stands there a while watching Nettie graze beside the daughter she almost didn't live to have. She doesn't say anything out loud. She doesn't need to. The ledger on the kitchen table already says it for her. Would you have raised your hand for $35 or looked away like everyone else in that yard? And when you picture Eleanor standing at that stall rail before dawn, alone with a labor going wrong. What do you think actually carried her through it? Thank you for staying with Eleanor and Nettie's story all the way to the end. Leave a comment and tell us your answer.